Dr. Binu, are you with ISP at KUSAT? Oh, hello, Dr. Nair.
Yes, yes, yeah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, namaskar. Very good to see you after a long time.
Yes, yes.
So you are still based in Kochi only?
Yeah, I am at Cochin today. Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, today. Otherwise, where are you based?
Yeah, many places are there, sir. Bangalore.
Oh, okay.
Abroad also.
Okay.
Okay.
How is
Extremely
Nest?
glad to have you today.
Okay, thank you. How is Nest doing? Good?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
So this Binu is with at present at ISP, I think, right, Binu?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is with KUSAT, sir.
Oh, okay.
So I think it is being streamed at the conference room. Their conference room. So a lot many students are there. Yeah.
Okay.
When you are ready, you can start.
Sir, shall we start the session?
Yeah, please. Yes.
Hello.
Go ahead, Binu.
She is
Am I audible?
No, you are muted. Dr. Binu, you are muted.
Sir, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Dr. Binu is muted.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the Thursday seminar organized by International School of Photonics in association with IEEE Kerala Chapter. We have with us today Professor Bishnu P. Pal, Senior Faculty and Professor, Department of Physics at Mahindra University's Ecole Central School of Engineering. He is also currently the Dean Academics at EMU. Prior to this, he had done a brief stint at Mahindra Ecole Central 2014 and was a professor of physics for over 24 years since 1990 at Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, during which he served as the chairperson of the physics department from September 2008 to December 2011 and head of the Computer Services Center September 2003 to August 2006. His current areas of research is guided wave photonics and optical communication that broadly encompasses application-specific specialty optical fibers, all fiber components and devices as branching components for optical communication network. He has published and reported over 200 research papers and research reviews in peer-reviewed international journals and conferences, delivered over 50 plenary or invited talks at international conferences in India and abroad, and has co-authored one each Indian and US patent. Today, Dr. Bishnu Pal will show that besides signal-carrying legally fibers like SMF28G652 and NISA DSF G655 fibers, there exists a big demand for application-specific specialty fibers. Several examples can be cited like dispersion compensating fibers for telecom networks, rarer doped fibers for signal amplification, fiber lasers, highly non-linear microstructured fibers for supercontinuum light generation, or chalcogenate plastic fibers for mid-infrared gigahertz generations and transmission through wavelength translation, hollow core fibers for extremely low loss propagation, multi-core fibers for space division, multiplexed high volume signal transmission, and so on. On behalf of International School of Photonics and IEEE Kerala Chapter, I invite Professor Pal to give his talk.
Thank you very much. Let me go to the presentation mode. Just 1 second. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Binu. And I received your invite almost about 2 weeks back when I was in Bangalore of the mid-semester break. And I thank the IPS Kerala chapter. It's good to talk to some of your colleagues whom I knew before and also see Dr. Suresh Nair. Okay, so this is the title of my talk, and outline of my talk would be something like introduction, specialty fibers, dispersion, compensating fibers, microstructured fiber, design of all fiber media light through wavelength translation, fiber optic sensors with specialty fibers. That would be a last topic, which will be, I will be, depending on time, I will try to cover. Let me see. And in that context, microband fiber optic sensors for detecting liquid spills, followed by conclusion. So, as you know, light guiding conduit, the first experiment on that was demonstrated by one gentleman known as Jean Daniel Colladon, although Tyndall's name is often cited, but correct name is Jean Daniel Colladon. And Tyndall actually repeated that experiment in some form. So he demonstrated optical confinement of light in a jet stream of...
Sir, excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Can you make it full screen?
Yeah, it is full screen. Why this thing is full screen? It's on the presentation mode.
Sharing the wrong screen. Sir, are you having dual monitor setup?
So the other monitor probably I should...
Yes, yes, you're sharing the wrong monitor, yes.
Okay, let me disconnect. Can you see now full screen?
Still the same monitor. Yes, thank you.
It should be now seen. No? Is it okay?
It is okay, sir.
Is readable from your end?
Yes, yes, it is very good.
Okay. So, the light guiding conduit in the sense of flow of water from a reservoir going down onto another reservoir, and the light is sunlight was used actually from the back end to launch light into this into the flow of water, and you could see that one could see the light is getting multiple total internet reflected in the conduit, which has a higher refractive index, that is that of water in contrast to air. So it is striking at the right angle. If you strike, it will show total internal reflection. That is basically the principle of light guidance in an optical fiber. Although if you go still deeper for the single mode fibers, you can't explain it on the basis of total internal reflection, but nevertheless, because there it is completely a wavy picture. So therefore, but basically this is the principle, which was actually, I quote from the journal Comtes Rendus, that's a French journal, old one in 1842, is quote, once entering the stream, the light rays encounter its surface under an angle small enough to experience a total internal reflection. The same effect repeats at each new point of incidence, so that the light circulates in the transparent jet-like inner canal and follows all the turns. Quote again, this is one of the most beautiful and most curious experiments that one can perform in a course on optics. So actually the lecture was on mechanics, but it was suggested that this is an experiment which can be a good demonstration of some functional behavior of optics. So in today's world, because we have laser in contrast to the solar light which was used in the very first experiment, and then it is much more apparent the total internal reflection in this helium neon laser light being contained within the flow of this water. So that is the basic principle which was proposed long time back, 1842. But today, optical fibers are ubiquitous in telecommunication networks, in nonlinear optics, laser systems, biomedical imaging, and sensing. So optical fibers has applications all over, everywhere actually, right now. Unfortunately, this is sometimes not recognized by general people because they take it for granted. So with so much of progress, is there any further scope for research on the topic of fiber designs? Answer is indeed yes. It's for the research scholars doing PhD students. You should know that there is still lots of scope for further designs of optical fibers, which are primarily for specialty applications. Normal applications people understand is telecom applications, so we call this the legacy fibers. So new requirements have arisen for restriction-specific specialty fibers with tailored characteristics like DCF, dispersion compensation with high figure of merit, bending sensitive fibers for taking signals from into home or office, fiber to the home, fibers for active devices like amplifiers, it requires specialty fibers, lasers and supercontinuum light sources also need specialty fibers, which are normally require very high, to be very highly nonlinear. In contrast to telecom fibers. You also require sometimes for large power throughput, large mode area fibers, highly nonlinear fibers for generational supercontinuum light, etc. I just told you, and wavelength translation. In my talk, I will be discussing quite a bit of it later on. Fibers and fiber-based devices for mid-IR wavelengths, which is an emerging topic of intense contemporary interest in mid-IR photonics. Plastic fibers for terahertz generation and transmission in terahertz photonics. So we have worked on almost all these areas in our when I was in IIT actually. So I'm not so much in research now at Mahindra University to an extent, but I do something new with some of my colleagues and metamaterials for terahertz. So mid-late 1970s, the legacy fibers were there, which could be multimode fibers, typically step index, core diameter 50 and overall diameter 125 micrometer as decided by the standards committees of telecom. And then the light guidance is also shown here as it was there within the water. So it is now a magnified version of that within a dielectric, so that you have a higher refractiveness minima N1, which is slightly higher than the surrounding media of refractive index N2. And even this guided light can negotiate bending up to some point. And so these are the normal fibers which we were accustomed to from early mid-70s. And there was another kind of fiber rather than step index. It was parabolic index fiber with the same kind of dimensions for the core and the cladding. And then actually, this is the generic refractive index profile of a parabolic index fiber. But when you fabricate, you may not necessarily achieve these two index exponent 2 for R by A to the power 2. So it could be anywhere near 2. So it could be slightly different from 2. Then the performance is slightly different. And there was a very nice theory, which has been patented theory from Bell Lab in 1973. They said that it is the generic power law profile. This because of this power 2, it's a power law profile. It could be anything from 1 to infinity. If it is 1, it's a trapezoidal refractive index like a triangular profile. Or if it is 2, if 2 is replaced by a very large number, you can't replace by an infinity for computation. You will see that it will tend to this step index type of. And light in this is the delta is the relative core cladding index difference. Typically for a multimode fiber, it is 1%. In case of single mode fiber, it is 0.3%. And in a gradient index fiber, the ray path is something like this, a sinusoidal. So it goes up, then bends, crosses the axis, and repeats this cycle. So that what happens is that the refractive index here is the maximum and it is minimum at the top. So whenever the light is traveling at a relatively lower medium, lower refractive index, it travels faster. So as a result, what happens is the light, if it is injected along central axis at 0 degree and at an angle which is the maximum capture angle or so-called numerical aperture of the fiber, they will roughly travel around, take this approximately same time to reach the end of the fiber, which leads to what is known as the low temporal pulse dispersion. And that is why it attracted a lot of attention, gradient index fiber in mid-70s to roughly about 79 or so. When 79, the single mode fiber with loss close to 0.2 dB achievable theoretically was announced from NTT and then completely changed the scenario of telecommunication from multi-mode to single mode. In 1980 onwards, it was all along single mode. Till recently, there was multi-mode interest has again been revived for some reasons. So basic elements of a talk is more for the youngsters, not for people like Dr. Nair or other professors at ISP. So this is the basic elements of an optical communication systems. You have a transmitter, which carries the telephone signal from nearby houses and so on, then gets to the exchange. It gets coded into digital format, and that digital format pulses will drive a laser diode, which then travels through an optical fiber, which is the transmission medium, and then the reciprocal process takes place at the receiving end, before finally they are converted into electrical signal and directed towards individual telephones, for which the number has been dialed from this side. So if you look at in a schematic fashion, this is the, this is as a function of time. This is f of t as a function of time. So something like I said in the class that I talk something on the microphone, take the output of the microphone onto an oscilloscope, which represents the voltage versus time. So this representation is roughly that, as if I am talking on a microphone, and you get an analog signal, which is anything depending on what you speak. This gets converted at the coding stage into equivalent pulses following the Shannon's theorem, and it gets converted these days into a pulse code modulated pulses signals, so that if you take a snapshot of one pulse, it will appear to be something like a Gaussian envelope of a carrier. This large frequency oscillations that you see within this is the carrier frequency and the optical frequency of the laser diode, and its envelope represents essentially one of this digit 1. So this goes into a fiber. Fiber is a dispersive medium. As it goes there, it will undergo what you call as dispersion. So the dispersed pulse at the output end of the fiber, which of course would be some length, some reasonable length, tens of kilometers, it will come out, this same pulse will come out in the form of a broadened pulse. If you do a more deeper calculation, you can show this pulse. Within this pulse, this frequency, this oscillations of the carrier, that has also undergone chirping. So you can see here the period is more, here the period is short. So that as a result of the dispersive behavior of the fiber, this pulse gets broadened as well as chirp. That leads to dispersion. So if I take this particular picture, here the transmitted pulse has 1, 1, 0, no pulse, pulse, no pulse, pulse. And at the receiving end, because of the dispersion, because of the broadening of each of these pulses, you can see there's an overlap between these two pulses, depending on the length where you are detecting. If the length is such that there is a loss of information, if the detector does not detect whether it is detecting the energy or signal from this pulse or this pulse, there is a loss of information. And as a result, there will be a confusion created at the receiver. So if I can, one of the requirements of telecom is a dispersion compensating fiber, which will sort of nullify this overlap or minimize this overlap, which has to be inserted in a telecom line, a telecommunication network. So this is already, we have shown this profile, and this is there is a quantification of the dispersion effect, which is shown by this expression, which is represented by capital D, as in terms of this. So here N effective is lambda naught and C are obvious. C is the velocity of light, wavelength lambda naught, and N effective, what is known as the effective mode index of a mode which carries the signal through an optical fiber. So that is ratio of the propagation constant of the mode with respect to the propagation constant in free space. So if you plot D as a function of wavelength, you can see there are 3 plots shown here. If you use only purely material effect, which is called as the material dispersion, material effect, which is the material dispersion, just like the phenomena that we see on a prism, as you see white light into a bezier color, that same phenomena is responsible for this curve in an optical fiber, because it is also susceptible to material dispersion. And this dotted line is called waveguide dispersion, which is not explainable on the basis of ray optics. Is explainable only on the basis of the extent of power in the core and the cladding in the form of wave optics. You can discuss and analyze that. So this is all along negative as a function of D as defined it here. So therefore, and what is the total net dispersion is the sum of these two. So if I add these two, I get, depending on their absolute the magnitude and different these wavelengths, you will see that the resultant curve of D as a function of lambda, which embraces both these components, is given by this curve. So this goes through a zero. This is on a legacy single mode fiber, which goes by the name of SM28, which is trade name of the single mode fiber of standard GC52 type, which comes out from Corning. So this is goes through a zero. Dispersion is zero here. But if you at another popular wavelength is 1.55 micrometer, where the loss is minimum, you get a dispersion value of approximately 15 to 17 picoseconds per kilometer, depending on nanometer, depending on what is the type of single mode fiber that you are using and sending signal. So this is the same curve. And so the concept of dispersion compensating fiber. The function and principle is that this is an input pulse. It goes broad, it becomes broadened, as you said earlier, as it goes through an optical fiber. And let us say this is the fiber is a transmitting fiber. So for the dispersion coefficient is represented with the suffix of Tx for the transmitting fiber. It is all along positive at the wavelength of operation. And so it gets broadened and chopped in this way. This is actually calculated curve. And if I now consider another fiber whose dispersion is opposite, D is opposite to that of dTx, that means it is negative all along the wavelengths of interest, then what happens? So it is understandable more easily by a Fourier analysis. I will not go into the mathematics, but let us say that to model dispersion, one does a Fourier analysis. So you have a input pulse, which is a pure, nice Gaussian input pulse, no chop, it is completely a neat pulse. You take the Fourier transform, this is F1 of t, you take, let me take that, I call this a stage 1. I take the Fourier transformation of it in the Fourier frequency space. I represent the Fourier transformation F1 of cap omega. It goes to the transmission fiber, whose dispersion coefficient, a second derivative of dispersion coefficient is what is called a GBD component, that is represented by second derivative of beta of the transmitting fiber's mode with respect to the omega. So this of the frequency, and it has a length this, it becomes a broadened pulse whose Fourier transform of the broadened pulse F2t, like this one. If I take the Fourier transform of this, I represent this by a F2 of cap omega. So this is after the coming out the transmitting fiber. Then I allow this broadened pulse to go through a fiber, which I called a dispersion compensating fiber, having a dispersion hoop velocity dispersion parameter as beta t double prime, in contrast to beta t double prime. And let us say its length is LD. And I assume that this pulse, this DCF, has compensated the dispersion completely and get you a nice neat pulse F3T, which is nothing but same as F1T. So at the stage 3, you get a already a nice neat pulse dispersion is whose dispersion is compensated. So if I consider this, and stage 2, the Fourier transform would look like something like this. Fourier transform at the stage 1 multiplied by an exponential factor, which is e to the power minus I beta t, this beta t double prime, corresponding LT into cap omega square. Cap omega is nothing but omega minus carrier frequency. At stage 3, it will be Fourier transform of this part. So Fourier transform of this part will be F2 this multiplied by the same logic, e to the power minus I, now it is beta d double prime LD omega square. So if I assume that this quantity is in the, so it is F2. So I substitute for F2 the F2 from here. So I will have F1 multiply this exponential factor and multiplied along with this exponential factor associated with the stage 3. Together, I will get an expression like this. So the exponent of the exponential is beta t multiplied to double prime into LT plus beta d double prime into LT. So if this quantity is made to be 0, that means product of these two quantity equals the product of these two quantity, then the net dispersion would be 0 and I will get back the original pulse. So naturally, to this become equal to this, one of these has to have a negative sign. So therefore, beta D is chosen, rather DCF is designed to be such that its GBD parameter beta D double prime is negative. So that this product ensures this equality and you get back the original. This is the basic principle of a DCF if you want to make a person or a student understand what is happening here. So now you know that signals are, because I don't have too much of time, so you know that today the signals are transmitted by wavelength division multiplexing. Therefore, there is a number of wavelengths for different laser diodes. They are all modulated in the time domain and sent simultaneously through a multiplexer through a single mode fiber, and they are demultiplexed at the other end of the single mode fiber and then redirected to appropriate space, appropriate telephone targeted receivers. Okay? So if I consider this pulse, this is the transmission fiber near 1550 nanometers, which is the wavelength where the loss in the single mode fiber is minimum. So that is the most attractive wavelength today for telecom operation. So if I consider dispersion as a function of wavelength nearby 1550 wavelength, covering all the DWDM wavelengths, then it would be look like this straight line. So if I consider a dispersion compensating fiber designed to compensate a median wavelength of 1550 band at 1550, that fiber should have dispersion as a function of wavelength look like this. But at this design, I am able to compensate exactly the same amount by a negative amount here, positive amount with the same negative amount here. So you will have dispersion completely compensating. But that will not be compensating for all the DWDM signals. So I need a broadband dispersion compensator, and for which the designers have found out, and we did a lot of work on that. One of my students' full PhD was on that. That you design a DCF which does not only compensates the dispersion value of transmitting fiber at nearby 1550 wavelengths, it also compensates the slope of dispersion. T versus lambda curve slope, if you have same as with this negative dispersion slope fiber, then you get a dispersion behavior which is exactly opposite to this. At every point, that magnitude of positive and negative will equal, and it will become a perfectly broadband dispersion compensating fiber. So there is a recipe for that, which is known as the kappa constant for the design dispersion compensating fiber. It should have the same value as that of the transmission fiber, and kappa is known to be a ratio of the dispersion and dispersion slope. So if you do that, then you will achieve. So this is clearly demonstrated here. This is an eye diagram. Those who do digital electronics, they would understand. You can see that in 1545, in a dispersion, single wavelength dispersion compensating fiber, the eye is fully open. So digital people understand the pulse is very clean. At other wavelengths, you can see there is a lot of distortions. Eye opening is not clear. But if you use a dispersion slope compensating fiber, we call as dispersion slope management, then in that case, all these wavelengths, which are all DWDM wavelengths in the 1550 band, you see the eye opening of the digital receiver is all very nice. So this has compensated all the different wavelengths carrying signals. So this is the concept of broadband dispersion compensating slope compensating fiber, or this broadband dispersion compensating fiber. One of the fiber designs which came out from our fiber optic scope, in which I was not an author, but there were people like Professor Terahertz, Professor Ghatak, Professor Goel, Professor Bashne. They had designed a fiber which is a dual core dispersion compensating fiber. It's a very excellent design. And so you can consider, as you can see, there's a one hump here, as if it is in the cladding, another equivalent hump in this other side. This is like a cladding, and as if this is the core. So if you look at it, and they are quite well separated from the central region. So I can treat this as two fibers, as one fiber with the central this height of delta 1 relative port-letting index difference. And this, along with this fiber, which is another independent fiber, as if for modeling, that these two are jointed in some way together, as if, and then giving you this particular profile. So since essentially I'm treating it as single fiber, and this is treating as another single fiber with this kind of reflective index profile, I can consider this composite structure like a directional control. And that is what was proposed from our group at the time. And we these are different parameters, so let us not go into the details of that. And then eventually, because of this attractive nature of this dispersion compensating fiber proposal, we got a very big Indo-French collaboration project with University of Nice and University of Limoges, of which I was the PI of that. Terahertz was my co-PI. And we did a lot of further designing of that and passed on the designs to those collaborators, and they actually made a single mode dual core fiber. There's dispersion compensator having at 1550 or dispersion coefficient of minus 1800 picoseconds per nanometer kilometer, which was the highest at that time. And it was a global world record actually at that time. And so this was an Indo-French collaboration, which also get an excellent grade for that particular work. So in that connection, we continued little more, and this was my student who is now a full-fledged PhD and is a faculty at Mahindra University, Dr. Kamna Pandey. She did with me some more work in which we targeted dispersion compensating broadband dispersion compensating fiber to compensate DW signals in G52 type of single mode fibers. And the net, these are published in Optics Communication, it gets very regularly cited. So different bands of amplification, S band, C band, L band, for which we have designed different dispersion compensating fibers for broadband compensation. And for G52 fibers, after joining our G52 fiber, the average net dispersion was about 100 kilometer of standard fiber with 10 kilometer of our design fiber. The net dispersion is well within 1 ± 1 picosecond per kilometer nanometer, but this entire broadband range for all the amplifier bands C, S, and L band. We then continued another work which was just published in Applied Optics to target the so-called non-zero dispersion shifted fiber. As you know that at 1550, if you make a dispersion zero, you can design a zero dispersion shifted fiber, but that becomes very sensitive to nonlinearity because of the zero dispersion. So people came out, mainly the three companies, Bell Lab, Lucent Technology at that time, Corning, and Alcatel from France, what they called as a non-zero dispersion shifted fiber. That means some finite dispersion at 1550 over the entire wavelength range. So for those fibers, we also designed broadband dispersion compensating fibers, which was published in Applied Optics. And it is the same thing that net dispersion after the joining of the DCF with a long length of appropriate length of a non-zero dispersion shifted fiber, average dispersion was within ± 0.1 picosecond per kilometer nanometer. So that was an initial part of my talk. Then let me talk to you about the EDFA revolution, which came in mid-1990s. Actually, EDFA was proposed and discovered at Southampton and simultaneously in Lucent Labs in USA around 1987. There's a little controversy who did first, but nevertheless, around the same time. So around 1987. And then it became a commercial product. By 1996, it went into actually a transatlantic network. So in an EDFA, you consider that it would be a black box, which is essentially about 10 to 15 millimeter length of a specialty fiber, which is doped with a rare earth, erbium, such that if you have broadband DWDM signals coming in, which are weakened after traveling through, let us say, about 80 kilometers to 100 kilometers, and then they hit this particular black box, that means this all weakened signals entered the erbium doped fiber, which is acting like an amplifier under a pump of 980 nanometer. All these wavelengths will significantly get rejuvenated or re-amplified, and they will all come out as an amplified signal, and then travel another 80 kilometers of standard fiber. So there are broadband gain spectrum, and one of the attractive feature of EGFA is a broad gain band. So C band covers 1530 to 1565, L band covers 1570 to 1610 nanometer. So we in this area we did one specific work along with CGCRI colleagues who had the fiber EDF fabrication facility, and we so as a part of our collaboration with the French people, along with our colleagues at CGCRI Kolkata, we did this work. We designed and fabricated an increasingly gain-fettered NVM code fiber amplifier. Actually, what happens is, okay, let me go a little. So if you plot the gain amplifier or gain as a function of wavelength, you see it is more or less flat around here, 1535 to something like 1565 in the C band, but there is a hump of approximately 8 to 10 dB extra gain at a slightly lower rate. So if you use such a gain amplifier, allow all the signals to enter this bandwidth of the amplifier, there will be relative gain of some of these wavelengths will be much higher compared to wavelengths here. That leads to some kind of a noise in the system. So what people used to do is, or rather do till now, is they put a gain flattening amplifier, a gain flattening filter, which is most often it is by a fiber Bragg rating, so that this hump is brought down on this wavelength band, and that becomes essentially a flat band. But what we targeted was that, which we reported at Clio in 2008, Nagaraju was another PhD student of mine who is now quite senior at Sterlite Technologies in Aurangabad. This was part of his thesis work. So what we designed was an inherently gain flat. That means this hump would not be there. So more or less, entire band of this would have a flat gain. So how did you do that? We again considered this dual core fiber, not a DCF, but a dual core fiber. Concept came from DCF. And what we said that is that we only partially dope that it is slightly different than the previous one. There it was, this portion was high, this portion was here. Now it is reversed. We designed it in such a way that lower refractive index contrast region is at the center, and it is surrounded by a ring of higher refractive index of a very narrow width. So if I dope this central region, the wavelength which will be whose energy or whose power would be mostly confined in this region, they will see a gain, and not the wavelengths whose power is not significantly here, but mostly around is here, more significant is here, then there will be, they will not see this gain. They will not see the presence of this amplifier. So therefore, this concept was made use of, and we designed it in such a way that this is the model field of LP01 mode. You see, most of the power is in the cladding in this case, but most of the power is in the core in this wavelength. So there is as I said, that this can be explained as a directional coupler. So there will be phase matching wavelength where the power can get transferred from one wavelength to the other, depending on where you have launched the power. So at the phase matching wavelength, longer wavelength greater than phase matching wavelength, is if you had launched power only in this central region, not allowing power to get launched in the ring region, then you will get an amplification such that most of the wavelengths are confined in the central region and they will get amplified. And for the shorter wavelength, then the phase matching wavelength, the power will spread into this region, and that they will be occupying mostly the cladding, where there is no doping. So this is actually fabricated fiber from CGCRI. This is the refractive index profile that I was talking about. You can see this ring, and this is the central region. And this is the net gain as a function of wavelength. So instead of hump, it has actually now come down. So we have overcompensated for those wavelengths. But nevertheless, the concept is that we did not use any, the fact is we did not use any filter to bring down this hump. It automatically, during the propagation to the NVM fiber, it has compensated for the extra gain in the amplifier. So next, I consider the birth of photonic crystals. As you know that there's a direct analogy between electron waves in natural crystal lattice and the electromagnetic wave in any periodic dielectric media. So if I consider electron waves, it are atomic sites, these are atomic potentials here. So if you allow the electron moving through this array of periodic potential, potential in a sense, but periodic atoms, and then it will be one scenario, and I consider another scenario. Okay, before that we all know from solid state physics that it will create some band gaps. So this is E versus K plot. So you can see around this region there is this curve does not exist. So there's an energy band gap, which is quite well known in semiconductor or solid state physics. Equivalently, if I consider a dielectric with periodic refractive index distribution like this, like a step refractive index, which is periodically repeated, as if this corresponds to this atom, this corresponds to this atom, and so on. And I consider now a propagation of an EM wave. So photon propagates through this periodic structure. This is the periodic structure. The photon is propagating. We also see there a band gap E versus K plot of this photon looks like this. It's the first band gap and higher order band and so on. So you can see there is similarity in terms of the band gaps where no electronic states can exist here. And here, no light of that frequency range will not exist, cannot propagate in this periodic structure. So that is called the photonic band gap. So the concept is very similar, and it arises because of the proper periodic media. So in 1987, there was a paper published in PRL by Eli Erbanovich. He was at that time in Bell Lab. And Sajeev John, actually, he is from Kerala. He is a professor in Toronto University. He also published in the same issue of the journal the concept of photonic crystals without knowing each other's work. Coincidentally, this is the same year when RBM fiber amplifier was discovered at Southampton University. So what they proposed in different language, they made this physics that a lattice of periodic refractive index features in a dielectric with the right spacing spawns certain optical band gap similar to the electronic band gap in semiconductor, as I shown in the previous slide. So what is meant by that is, if you consider a two-dimensional structure like here, where these portions correspond to air holes, they are periodically placed in this direction as well as in this direction. The spacing between these white regions, which are air holes, in a dark background. Dark background is essentially a dielectric, just to show that they are different. This structure will give you a certain band gap in which certain wavelengths, if you consider entire electromagnetic spectrum, the certain wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum will not be allowed to propagate in the structure. And that is how it is called, it is giving, this photonic crystal is giving a band gap, but those band of frequencies are not allowed, or wavelengths are not allowed to propagate. If, however, I create a defect here, for example, I do not create a hole at the center, so it is black in this region, just imagine. So it is a defect in contrast to the otherwise periodic structures. Periodic here in terms of refractive index features. There's a refractive index here. Then those band of wavelengths which were not allowed by the band, when it was completely a band gap structure, they would now be allowed to propagate. So if this is removed, I don't create this, then those band of wavelengths will propagate through this region, mimicking as if it is a core and is surrounded by a periodically stretched structure, air hole cladding, whose overall refractive index will be smaller than the central region because there is no air. This black portion is occupied by a large number of holes, air holes. So average refractive index of the surrounding would be small, smaller as compared to the central dark region, and it will mimic an optical fiber kind of or guided wave propagation in the structure. So light in the optic is disallowed, but it will, except for a defect, that it will propagate. So taking this idea further, so concept is here, as I said, that if you have a central region of high refractive index, that is the background. Here, instead of black, I'm showing background as white and white holes as air holes as black dots. So then you will have an effectively total internal reflecting structure, which we will normally called as a modified total internal reflecting structure, mimicking guided wave propagation in such media. I could also have a defect where this is a much bigger hole than any of these holes, than any of the surrounding holes. So that will also be different as a defect is contrast to that. But in this case, the refractive index at the central region would be smaller than the average refractive index of the surrounding medium. So this is an anti-guide. It's not a guide, but it's an anti-guide. But this also shows, since this is a defect, it supports those band of wavelengths and they go propagate through this. So advantage is if this is just air, it will feel very low loss medium and you can achieve very low loss. This picture shows that this is at the other end, you inject a white light here into the structure, and at the other end, you see, you pick up that whatever is coming out, you can see there's a lots of different colors. So that means it is highly wavelength selective structure. A pattern of colors illustrates how the confinement property of photonic band gap fiber strongly depends on wave. So this is an index guided microstructured fiber, I will say, rather than photonic crystal fiber structure. David Kine and I together, we never say PCF, photonic crystal fiber, although Yablonovich says so, because we feel that has a clash with plastic clad fiber. So it is, I rather call this as a microstructured optical fiber. So there are broadly these two types of microstructured fiber, which is generally, this effect is also apparent in nature. For example, butterfly, wings of the butterfly or opal crystal at different angle, if you look, you see different colors. So it does actually photonic band gap effect. So now you consider the same photonic crystal structure proposed by those two authors from in the PRL paper. Now let us get it translated to a cylindrical structure as like an optical fiber. So this constitutes shows the cross section of a macroscopic preform of a large number of what is called canes, or rather capillaries, which are stacked together, and the portion of which is exposed to in a furnace, so that this whole thing collapses symmetrically depending on the nature of the design of the furnace, and you get a replication of this in a much smaller dimension across the whole length of the fiber. These are called microstructured optical fibers. So fibers with an internal periodic structure form through capillaries filled with air typically lead to form a hexagonal lattice. Yes. So, okay, this is the process. You stack them together, fuse them at certain around this temperature, and they yield a photonic crystal fiber or microstructured optical fiber. There are assortment of microstructured optical fiber. Index guided fibers could be a high numerical aperture. You can choose that by choosing a bigger hole and have a larger hole, so that larger fraction of air occupies the cladding with respect to the central region. Large mode area fiber, highly nonlinear fiber. You can make a high confinement of the light by choosing a rather larger refractive index contrast in the central guiding region. This will be highly nonlinear index guided fiber, and correspondingly photonic band gap guided fiber, where the central region is here surrounded by photonic crystal structure as in here, and it could be low index core or it could be a hollow core, completely hollow core. It's a big attraction today, hollow core fiber, and there could be fibers which are known as a Bragg fiber, where this corresponds to certain rings of refractive index contrast surrounding the central lower index region. And there we did a lot of work. It's again another PhD student. Her name is Sonali Dasgupta, who has a company of her own in Bangalore now, settled in Bangalore. So this is a Bragg fiber of the kind that we worked on, which is low index region, surrounded by concentrating alternate high and low index region. So if you plot the refractive index profile, it looks like this: alternate high, low refractive index regions of certain width, and the spacing cap lambda, and central region is lower index than any of this, our average index of this region. So essentially, it is a leaky structure because you have low index core surrounded by effectively higher refractive index structure. But if you follow certain law or satisfy certain law, which is called the there is a name for it. I'm just missing it. So then you can make it highly confined within the core, and leakage loss would be minimal. So we had several papers on this. In his Professor Shenoy was also a co-guide, so we reported in different journals. So let us consider a highly nonlinear Pulley fiber. That means holy fibers means also the microstructure fibers are some people call it holy fibers because there are a lot of holes in the microstructure cladding. So we consider a core which is surrounded by so many holes, holy structure is another lot of it. So you can see there's a bigger holes. So large air fraction is sitting here, a very small core of high index. So this will give a high numerical aperture fiber and a very strong nonlinear effect here. So if you consider such a fiber, and if you actually modern pattern, if you look at it, it looks like this. Let us not go into those details. Ultimately, what I wanted to show you is that you can control the dispersion in such a fiber by choosing the fiber air core diameter of different region, different dimensions. So you can see that zero dispersions for one of these fibers is here, whereas at zero dispersion, another fiber of small, another fiber of higher, bigger dimension is shifted to somewhere here. So if you have you design the fiber such that its dispersion is minimum at a wavelength where you will pump in a high power laser light, a femtosecond laser. So this was the first reported at a conference in ECOC in 1998. This is Ranka. He's an Indian working at Bell Lab at the time. So they showed that they pumped about 800 nanometer wavelength into such a structure, and what they got at the output was a very broad band spectrum light, which they called as the supercontinuum light. So supercontinuum light generation essentially involves as exploitation of all these different nonlinear effects, four-way mixing, self-phase modulation, cross-phase modulation, and so on. And a short femtosecond pulse goes through it, it gets broadened at the other end of the medium, nonlinear medium. So these are the Institute of Optics. I got some pictures. So these are different form of supercontinuum light seen in the experiment. So we did some work. We did quite a bit of work again on nonlinear Bragg type of fiber, and demonstrated for the first time supercontinuum light from a Bragg fiber in a collaboration work, experimental work with Russian scientists at the Russian Academy of Science. So we did that. This is our designs we shared with our Russian colleagues. They fabricated it. You can see the concentric alternate dark and bright rings correspond to different refractive indices. And we did that. And then this was actually transported to another friend who's my schoolmate, Dr. Professor Ajay Kar at Terahertz University. He had a high power optical amplifier, what you call as the parametric amplifier source at around this wavelength of 1000. And then I planned that I will use a neodymium laser, but he had that one. So this is a femtosecond laser or a light coming out here, going through this and gets broadened at different level of power. So this is the supercontinuum. So this was demonstrated by us, reported in Optics and Optics Express. Now I come to quickly for specialty fibers for mid-IR application, where we exploit again a nonlinear effect of photonic wave mixing. It was mostly PhD work of my student Ajanta Bhatt, who is right now in ETH, Switzerland. So this represents the transmittance as a function of wavelength for different materials suitable for mid-IR fibers. And also refractive index of a nonlinear medium is, many of you would know, it can be represented by the linear part and the nonlinear part, which is the nonlinear contribution to refractive index multiplied by, because it has a dimension of inverse intensity, multiplied by the intensity of the propagating light. So the effective refractive index seen by the propagating light would be given by this linear part, and this is the nonlinear part. So if N2 is high, the nonlinear contribution would be large. So this is a tabulation of different kinds of materials which could serve as a nonlinear optical fiber. Out of this, these two, AS2S3 and AS2SE3, these are chalcogenide group of materials having this kind of refractive indices, and this is the N2 value this much, and the transmission window in the mid-IR wavelength regime. So we chose these materials to design in a project that we had worked with Naval Research Lab in Washington to exploit four-way mixing in a chalcogenide fiber that we designed in such a way that it gives strong nonlinear effect, so that if you pump it at the right wavelength for the designed fiber, it will give out a signal which would be longer than the pump wavelength. I represent it as if a red, and another wave would be coming out, which would be shorter. I call this as an idler. So we have also seen that if I have the four-way mixing process taking place, but if you seed it with a small portion of the idler, then the effect becomes stronger. So the pump wavelength is here, signal is a longer wavelength, and idler is generated at a shorter wavelength. This is the schematic of a four-way mixing process, which requires conservation of energy in terms of this equation and conservation of momentum in terms of this equation. The frequency in the frequency space, the frequency shift can be defined as WP minus W signal or WI minus WP. So if you transpose this to the other side, it will be twice WP is equal, and this on the other side, it will be twice WP is equal to WS plus WY. That would be the energy conservation law for such a four-way mixing process, where two photons of same frequency are actually mixing. These are called the degenerate four-way mixing. And this cap lambda S can be essentially then eventually modeled and shown that they are strongly dependent on GVT parameter beta 2 and the fourth order GVT parameter beta 4. Gamma is the nonlinear coefficient well known. It is the ratio of these two quantity 2 pi n2 divided by lambda naught into A mode effective area of the fiber. So this diagram is very important that we had calculated and designed the fiber accordingly. We have seen that at 2.04, the signal generated is very strong as compared to the idler. So therefore, we chose a 2.04 wavelength as a pump wavelength. And 2.04 wavelength is also a wavelength where thulium doped fiber lasers emit. So they are commercially available and high power is available. So we designed such a mid-ion wavelength source from a nonlinear fiber, in which we used a thulium doped fiber laser as the pump, and the signal comes out at around 4.36 micrometer. So, and it is a narrowband source at that wavelength. For getting a narrowband wavelength with the chalcogenide materials as the base materials, in which several layer holes are assumed to be created, except with this is the finer aspect of the design. The second ring is of a slightly bigger diameter. Then you get ideally about 17% conversion of pump into media wavelength of 4.36 micrometer. And to make it a narrowband source, you need beta 2 should be positive, small and positive, and beta 4, D2 beta D4, D2 D4 beta D omega 4 to be negative. Then only you can achieve a narrowband mid-ion light source. So there are benefits of change of slightly different R2 is because the confinement loss at the generated signal decreases significantly because of this, and its variation has negligible effect on the position of lambda ZT and the nature of dispersion curve. So fine tuning is possible. It's all explainable in terms of physics, but we do not have so much of time to go through so much of details. I've given you the paper reference. Everything is explained there. So for full width half maxima is about 16 nanometer, around 4.36 micrometer. And you can see the fiber has been designed to have zero dispersion close to the available commercially high power fiber laser of a thulium doped fiber. In this case, it was 2.105 rather than 2.04. So this gives that within 1.36 micrometer, amplification factor is almost to 20 dB of the signal relative to the input power. And for the idler, it is only 6 dB. Efficiency 17.6% and full width half maxima of 16 nanometer. We did also a broadband wavelength source from such a chalcogenide designed fiber with the design parameters different, so that it emits wavelength from 3.1 to 4.35 micrometer when it is pumped with a source which is an erbium doped Z-plan laser. Is again commercially available at 2.79 micrometer. 10 watt of that yielded a broadband output, which is about 1.25 micrometer. It was 16 nanometer there, it's now 1.25. It's a broadband from 3.1 to 4.35 micrometer. So we have series of papers published in this for different wavelengths. One of this was at with narrow wavelength band at 6.45 micrometers, which is of tremendous applications in biological, for biomedical applications. because it gives you non-destructive soft tissue ablation in medical surgery. It provides minimum collateral damage for brain, nerve, and skin tissues, etc. around that wavelength if you use this for surgery or removal of defective tissues. So it was again a similar structure. Here in this case, the third ring of diameter was slightly different. And instead of air holes here, it was filled with PES, a material known as polyether sulfone, based overall microstructure fiber. And these are the different parameters that we used or optimized for the best design. And we get a broadband source from 5 to 6.3 micrometer. When it is pumped with a commercial carbon monoxide laser at 5.6 micrometer, within a length of 1 meter, we could get a conversion efficiency of almost 32%, 40%. That's a power conversion efficiency, 40% for 5 to 6.3 micrometer. Now coming to another topic, specialty fibers for terahertz applications. I may take just 5 minutes more. So there's only a few slides I will give. The concept is very similar. Used again a Fourier mixing process. Terahertz gap is a wavelength regime in the electromagnetic spectrum, which separates microwaves from the infrared region. So 0.3 to 3 millimeter. These are there are a lot of applications. You can see any journal or book. This is a book I'm giving as a reference, where from I have taken this. So these terahertz finds extensive applications, including, as you know, airport security, homeland security, and so on. So we had designed a plastic fiber for terahertz generation through wavelength translation, which essentially implied Fourier mixing. This has now got, this was picked up by a publisher in a book with this name that is shown at the bottom. And it is coming out, I think, this year. So this particular paper was now also available, should be available soon in a book. The platform that we used was a nonlinear polymer, typically Teflon. This Teflon is a suitable polymer which has an N2 value, nonlinear coefficient to its refractiveness part, and it is suitable for both median and terahertz. I used a preset of, now in this case we considered assumed a CO2 laser, which you know is available. Siken Patel was the discoverer of that when he was in Bell Lab. It emits at a wavelength of 10.6 micrometer and a power of 1 kilometer, which sometimes people, raise their eyebrows. There's so much of power, but average power across because effective area of the fiber is very large. So average power is essentially very small. And I will show you that at the next slide. It was also a concern of the reviewers who had studied this paper, but this paper we submitted somewhere around April 13, and by April 30, it got published. So it was of good interest, I think, at that time, 2015 or 2016, around that time, 2015. So it's a microstructured fiber for dispersion and nonlinear management, making use of the similar concept that is. So we proposed a fiber here, which first, let us say that I consider a Teflon-based cross-section of a fiber in which the central region is essentially a large number of holes in a hexagonal fashion, as if this is normally the cladding region in microstructured fiber. Rather, we consider that we created this in the central region. The blue region, this is a discretized core, large bore area fiber for optical input. Independently, we have done some work on that and already published here to achieve a very large, more effective area of a microstructured optical fiber. So we use that concept. Then this fiber, let me now find out an equivalent fiber for that. Because here there is an average refractive index of this region would be small as compared to the surroundings, because there are a lot of holes here also. So now this is becoming as if the whole thing is just one fiber of this core, and it is then jacketed with another, another tube of Teflon, which is shown as a lighter blue color. So this, together with this, will effectively give a fiber structure which is like this. This is this structure, which is the equivalent structure here, surrounded by a lower refractive index Teflon around this. So that is we call this a microstructure what they call that means MCDCPF. It is just let me see what we have named it. Just a little below it will be appear. It is a microstructure, essentially micro core, microstructured core, dispersion, compensating, plastic fiber, something like that of that order. So no, it is double. I'm sorry. This is just microstructure core double clad. This is double clad plastic fiber. That is the name acronym that we gave for it. These are the parameters. So refractive index of the different regions are 1.425, the highest region, and otherwise is surrounded by surrounded by 1.44 and 1.4. And these are the radial dimensions of the different region. So with this structure, this is the calculated mode field pattern at the terahertz frequency of 3 terahertz. Mode is confined in this central region, and these are 4 rings of higher effective index at 1 micrometer diameter. Lambda effective is 30,000 micrometer square at a pump wavelength, and it assumes an effective dimension of area of 78,000 micrometer square at the signal wavelength. So the signal is at a terahertz frequency. So because of this very large effective mode area, even though I have pumped in a very large power, overall power per unit area is relatively small. So effective pump intensity as a function is rather small. It is only 0.003 gigawatt per centimeter square. So this I plot as the generated signal power as a function of wavelength in the terahertz regime, and you can see that this is peaking around 3 micrometer. This is in terahertz, yeah. So is a frequency at 3 terahertz, around 3 terahertz, it is peaking almost like 30 degrees here. So assuming 1 unit of power as incident. So output is about 3 terahertz at 3 terahertz, which is about 100 micrometer. Output power is almost 30 watt. So conversion efficiency is 0.3%, which is the highest conversion efficiency reported, at least till that time. I don't know if people have achieved little higher conversion efficiency in terms of quantum conversion efficiency. So it's an efficient design. And this is another fiber. We did it for terahertz transmission. So in this case, rather than a photonic microstructure index guided fiber, it is now in photonic bandgap guided fiber, but the central region is a higher dimension of the core surrounded by photonic crystal cladding of air holes. And the characteristics where the Teflon used in the red region is Teflon of 1.44, which is the lowest Teflon refractive index contrast with respect to air as compared to any other polymers. So it leads to low scattering loss, and this was published in Photonic Technology Letters. So this shows the transmission loss coefficient as a function of frequency in the terahertz domain. You can see the loss is pretty low, and if you consider the GVD parameter is almost flat and going through a zero again around 1.8 terahertz frequency. So these are broad characteristics of this particular fiber. We have theoretically demonstrated photonic bandwidth guidance over a bandwidth of 400 gigahertz from 1.65 to 2.05 terahertz fiber. Just one more sample of specialty fibers for sensing. So this is a fiber. This is a multimode fiber actually. This is a multimode fiber which is laid like this over a Kevlar stretch of Kevlar, which is a material used in fiber cabling, and it is surrounded by, and so it is stretched over here. So this portion is the Kevlar region, and this yellow portion is a hydrogel material, which is a polymeric coating. Hydrogel is such that if it absorbs water, it swells inside. This is like the diaper of the baby's diaper that has contains the same material. As water or urine gets in there, it gets flattened up. So it grows inside. And since this fiber is tied with this overall structure, if there is anywhere water there, which comes in contact with this polymer coating here, hydrogel, then that portion will get flared. It will become bigger. As a result, it will start sort of pressing the fiber and create a microband in the fiber. And you know that microband fibers introduces losses. So this work was done mostly, and we did some work along with Strathclyde University people. So it is a dry polymer. Fiber is here, which is sort of stretched, wrapped around the hydrogen. And when hydrogen comes in contact with water, it will swell, creating a microband on the fiber link. And that leads to loss. And this can be detected in an OTDR, this can be detected in OTDR instrument, which many of you know, used in detecting any problem along the lay of the fiber. So wherever this portion of the fiber is jointed with the telecom fiber, and you get a signal of microband induced loss, you know that there is a water spill in that region. You can configure the hydrogen with many other polymers and sensitive to materials like petrol and so on, and you use the same concept to sense the presence of spill of any unwanted liquid material. So this is just one example of a specialty fiber. This kind of fiber is produced by a company from UK, used to be. I have no idea whether they are still being produced, but this was used very successfully to demonstrate distributed measurement of water or say petrol spillage or some other spillage of some other material which you don't want to, which you do not want any spill. So I have come to an end of my lecture. Roughly took a little more than time. The conclusion is there is a necessity of social fibers. I tried to highlight that, and that has a lot of scope for further research for young people. Dispersion compensating fibers I have discussed, which we had done a lot of work. Actually, there is not too much expected now of dispersion compensating fibers innovation, because the dispersion compensation today in practical high intensity, high signal transmission network is done with borrowing idea from wireless dispersion compensation, which are electrical compensation at the receiving end. Then microstructure optical fibers of variety of applications I have discussed. Highly nonlinear fibers of microstructures for realizing all fiber media and light sources, both broadband and narrowband. I also gave you an example of little work that we did on terahertz fiber optic light source, including terahertz wavelength transmission and another one photonic bandgap guided, and microband fiber optic sensor for detecting liquid space. I would like to acknowledge a large number of my former graduate students, colleagues and collaborators. Sonali Dasgupta, PhD, she was my grad student. Kamra Pandey was my grad student, now faculty here. They've all now become big. Ajanta Bar is doing extremely good work at ETH with Ursula Kelar. Somnath Ghosh is an associate professor and associate dean at IIT Jodhpur. Nagaraju is a senior person in R&D at Starlight. Ravindra Bashne, R.K. Bashne, M.R. Shanai, Tyagarajan were my former colleagues at IIT Delhi. And my collaborators from Naval Research Lab as these people, Ishwar Agarwal, El Bisho, Jasangera. Azizur Rahman from City University was also my collaborator in that project of microstructure fibers from EQARE, which was one of the very big projects that we had got, 415,000 pounds. Govind Agarwal, my batchmate in research at IIT Delhi, and still we are very good friends and we still collaborate, who is in Institute of Optics, Rochester. And funding agencies which covered this whole work were Office of the Naval Research Global, USA, and UKID through British Council. Thank you very much. I am done. Dr. Nair.
Any questions?
If you want, I can share the slides with Dr. Bino later as a PDF form. So you will get all the references there, those who are interested.
Thank you, Professor Paul, for your wonderful presentation. And it covered almost every aspect of fiber optics, including the latest developments. I had one question regarding the gain flattening, inherent gain flattening you were mentioning.
Yeah.
What was its advantages compared to the long period grading method? By concatenating many long period gratings, we can also
Even achieve very good efficient filter, but that is an extra component. No? So if I have a network, particularly our design is more attractive for metro network, which has a lot of components. So any network operator, you have Dr. Nair sitting there, they would always go for an economic solution to any product development or as a device deployment in a network. So if you use a long period rating, yes, that can filter. We have done also the work similar to that. Professor Thiagarajan led that work. So, but that is an extra component which you have to splice with the Airbnb fiber. So there is a splice source component involved here on one side, then another splice source component involved there on the signal fiber to be spliced after the filter. So that it becomes more economic if you can achieve the filtering within the fiber itself, within the Airbnb fiber amplifier itself. That is the advantage, and that is the main advantage. Is it clear? Am I clear?
Yes, it is clear, sir.
So you need not use another component to do that. You need not do even long period. You can also do with a normal grading, FBGs. FBGs are very good filters. So you reflect that portion of light partially to an extent that it compensates for the extra gain in D. But that is an extra component which is coming into the picture. So why we were actually driven to this problem by some people from Alcatel. Alcatel people met me somewhere in Nice, around that time when you worked, and they said, can you design something which is inherently gain flattened, that will have an attraction for metro-centric fiber network.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Now, I would like to propose the vote of thanks. First of all, let me thank our chief guest, Professor Bishnu Bipal, for spending his valuable time and giving an excellent presentation on application-specific specialty optical fibers. Next, I would like to thank IEEE Kerala Section and International School of Photonics for hosting the event. Finally, let me thank all the faculties, research scholars, students, and everyone who participated in the event for making it a success. Thank you.
Thank you. Would it be in YouTube or it would be just there? You have recorded, no, whole thing? Hello, Dr. Binu?
Sir, I just joined with ISP, International School of Photonics. I'm sitting with them only. And sir, a very big thank you for accepting my invitation and giving a memorable lecture. And sir, I have also one question. Sir, normally in EDFA, we use continuous wave signals for amplification. But in some cases, we need to give pulsed signals as the input. So in that case,
tell me.
In that case, these pulsed signals, their shape get distorted after amplification. Is it because of, sir, because in EDFA we are using doped fibers. So is it because of the doped fiber properties, or it because of the concentration or anything connected with that? Or is there any way to reduce or minimize the distortion?
You see, normally it is not used as, you can demonstrate for a continuous wave, but since it is used in real network, it is always, only the pulses are centered. Pulses are different colors. They are coming and going through as a weekend pulse, and they are going through the EDF. So there could be some amount of distortion. So in the real network, what they do is a combination of dispersion, compensation, and amplifier. So there are issues whether I should put the dispersion compensator before the amplifier or after the amplifier. So there we have also done some work on that, with which Professor Tyagarajan and myself were involved. And so it depends on your purpose, but it's not a problem. It is not a problem because the actual length of the fiber amplifier is only 10 to 15 meters. So distortion would be there. Theoretically, you can show for research studies you can do, but in practically that distortion is virtually very little. It's not of a concern.
Okay. Okay, sir. Okay.
You see, all undersea transmission, they contain a large number of fiber amplifiers. So typically for about 10,000 miles or about 10,000 miles separation undersea, you need roughly about 150 to 200 amplifiers. So they're all lying on the seabed. And once it is put, it is just performing absolutely nicely. There's no problem at all. So all our internet signals are coming from San Francisco, Google search, etc. You do, it's coming from there. So they're all traveling through all this undersea fiber cable. Finally, in India, they land at Bombay, and then they're distributed to different cities.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
There's not an issue. I was trying to ask you that have you recorded it?
Yes, sir. It is recorded. It's available in a YouTube. Yeah.
Oh, it will be available. Can you?
I will send you the link also.
Because Professor Ghatak is very busy today. He wanted to lecture. Listen to the lecture. I shared with him the link, but he said that will it be available in YouTube? Then I would like to see. I would like to listen later. So you said you give me the link.
Yeah, sure. I will do.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we are done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay then. Okay, Dr. Nair, if you are still there.
Sir has left the meeting because he has some other meeting now. So
I know he's very busy. Okay. So all my best wishes to everyone at ISP, where I used to come very often earlier. And Professor Radhakrishna was there and Namburi sir was there. So they were very close to me. And I wish all of you great future at ISP. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Okay.
Can I leave now? Yeah.
Yeah, sure, sir. You can
Thank you.
YouTube link.